Hello bass players, Alex here again to talk to you about caring for your instrument, including adjustments, setups, maintenance, and selecting new strings. Some of these things you can easily learn to do yourself, but sometimes it's best to take it to a professional. Strings come in all sorts of materials, lengths, thicknesses, and windings. Your bass, of course, should come with strings on it, but you will also need to replace them at some point, probably at least once a year. Bass strings can last a very long time, and the only real reason to replace them is usually the sound. Over time, they can lose their tone and sound kind of dead and rubbery. But aside from sounding terrible, you can usually leave strings on as long as you like. I'm not going to go over how to change strings in this lesson. We're going to focus more on the selection of strings. But I will tell you that when you do change your strings or have them changed, they don't sound very good at first. It takes about 10 hours of playing to lose their tinny quality. They have this kind of high-end quality, and they don't get their full low-end bass sound until about a few hours of playing them. So if you don't like the sound of your strings right away, just play through it and be patient. One of the most important things to consider when selecting strings is gauge. This is the thickness of the string measured in thousandths of an inch. So a 100 gauge string is 100 thousandths of an inch thick. The gauge of the strings you are buying will usually be shown as a range from the thinnest string in the package to the thickest string in the package. 45 to 100 would be 45 is the size of the thinnest string, 100 is the size of the thickest string. This is considered a lighter gauge and probably a good choice when you're just starting out. If you use a thicker gauge, you will get a thicker, more boomy, bassier tone. But that thicker string will also bend the neck of the bass, or tend to, and it will require a readjustment, also making the bass possibly harder to play. Nice thick tone, harder to play. Nice thick tone, harder to play. Another choice you have in string selection is roundwound or flatwound strings. Traditionally, most bass players play roundwound strings, which means the winding on the outside of the string is a round piece of wire, versus flatwound strings, which are wound with a flat metal and are very smooth. Your choice here is based mostly on tone. Any style of music can be played with either set of strings. The roundwound strings tend to have a little bit more snap to them and more tone in the high end, while flatwound strings sound like they feel. They feel very smooth and with a very nice round tone. In fact, I often mistakenly call flatwound strings roundwound because the tone is actually very well rounded. I actually played exclusively flatwound strings for many years because I just love the sound of them. Now I keep basses with both flatwound and roundwound strings so I can choose which tone I want for any given situations. If your bass doesn't play and feel exactly the way you want it to, you'll want to get a setup done on it. A person who works on a bass or guitar is called a luthier. This is who you want doing your setup. Try to find someone with experience, someone you have a good feeling about, and of course someone you trust to work on your instrument. Some things you can do yourself, but I'm going to leave it up to you as to whether or not you want to pursue maintenance as part of your bass playing. I'm going to talk about a few of the basic things that your bass might need. If there's something that you want to learn about, there are a lot of good YouTube videos and websites where you can learn more about this kind of work. One of the most common and basic things your bass might need is a truss rod adjustment. This is one of the very few things that I actually do myself, and probably worth pursuing as a skill for most bass players. Almost every bass has a truss rod, which is a piece of metal that goes through the neck from end to end. This rod can be tightened and loosened to either increase or decrease the tension on the neck. The strings pull an incredible amount of tension, and that tension must be countered by the neck. My 6-string bass, for example, holds 200 pounds of tension with the strings alone. That's a lot of tension. Think of the strings and the neck as being in a constant battle. If the strings are winning, that bends the neck up, and the distance from the strings to the frets increases. We call this the action. A bass with high action is harder to play, but if the action is too low, then the strings can't ring out and they just rattle against the frets. In that case, the neck is winning the battle for tension. Experienced bass players may desire slightly higher or lower action, but basically you want the action fairly low without getting any buzzing from the strings rattling against the frets. On many basses, you can just set it and forget it, but sometimes a bass will be sensitive to the weather or other conditions. My 6-string bass is particularly sensitive, and I generally adjust it about twice a year. Don't experiment with the truss rod without getting more information about it first, but if you are careful, then this is definitely something that you can do on your own at home. Another adjustment that might be needed is intonation. If you tune your strings properly, but your frets high up on the neck sound out of tune, this is a problem with the adjustment of the bridge. Again, this is something you can learn about and do at home fairly easily, or take it to a luthier. Once this is done properly, it should pretty much hold its tune. Aside from changing your strings once or twice a year and possibly adjusting your truss rod, your bass shouldn't require very much regular maintenance. But things can happen to it over time, like getting scratchy sounds when you turn the knobs. Underneath each knob is something called a pot, which is what controls the electronics. These can be cleaned or replaced as needed. If you're getting absolutely no sound out of your bass, it's likely that the jack or something else in the electronics has failed. If you're into soldering and schematics, look it up online and have fun with it. Otherwise, find yourself a good luthier. That's about it for care and maintenance. There's not really a lot to do there, but these are things that you should be aware of.